I'm Kevin Kampman. I'm the president of the Clark County Amateur Radio Association, and we're at the exhibit at the Historical Society on amateur radio in Clark County. It's hosted by the museum in the Clark County Amateur Radio Association, whose call sign is W8OG. W8OG belonged to a member of the club, and that became, if you will, a memorial to that member and something that we use to identify our radio stations on a daily or permanent basis. And it's licensed to us by the Federal Communications Commission. When we put our exhibit together, it attracted a lot of community interest. And lo and behold, one of the people that came forward was the young lady who I'm with today, Kris Kolbinskie. She is the granddaughter of W8OG, and she came to us with memories of her grandfather and his radio station. So, Kris, let's start out by discussing some of the major things you remember about him and his radio.
My grandpa, Donald Ream Sr., was a ham radio operator from before I was born. And when I think of him, I have 2 or 3 very vivid memories about his involvement as a ham operator. One, he had a very extensive setup in the basement, and he would disappear there every night after dinner. But in the 60s, he patched people together via his radio, from soldiers from Vietnam to Catholic nuns in South America, people that couldn't otherwise contact family members here in the States. He also enjoyed helping other radio operators with their setups and helped build and enhance their equipment. He spent probably every other Saturday morning at what we call the radio store. And then he, at one point, built, I don't even know how tall it was, but a tower in the backyard. And we just thought of Grandpa as W8OG. And I would spend hours just sitting next to him in front of his equipment, not really understanding what it all did, but I enjoyed listening to him and learning some of the parts and pieces of his workshop.
You were telling me how he announced himself on the air. How did that sound?
Yeah, I can just hear his voice from 40 or 50 years ago saying, this is W8OG, W8 Ocean, Georgia. And I'll just never forget the sound of that over and over. And I remember his call letters were always on his license plate for his car. So it was just ingrained in our family, family lore.
How involved was the family with him as far as radio was concerned?
Not really at all. Our dad, his only son, only child, really didn't have an interest. And I think if I had been a little older and been a little more aware of what it was he was doing, it really predated the internet as I see it. And I picked up that interest myself as an adult, but I just wish I could have picked his brain and understood how to build and operate his equipment. We're still looking for pictures of his workbench and his desk and all the equipment, but I did find a few snapshots. This was when he still had equipment upstairs in the dining room on his house on Rose Street. So I don't remember it being in the dining room. I'm sure he got banished to the basement after the family started to grow a little bit. But we do have his a couple of pictures of some of his early equipment and his call sign as well.
So this is a very interesting picture. I had just seen it as we sat down, and the piece of equipment that's in it, actually surrounding the child in the picture, is one of the large Hallicrafters radios. And it was in two pieces, but it was known for how big it was. It was used by the military in World War II for major communications. And it weighed about 387 pounds shipping weight. So there's two huge cabinets here, and there is a smaller Hallicrafters in the exhibit. These were very large vacuum tube radios. Another radio that's in the picture, this was the big surprise, is what we call an ARC-5 transmitter. And right behind you, we have one of those transmitters. These were very popular after World War II because they came out of aircraft. You know, if you think about the bombers and so forth that flew during the war, there were thousands of them. They had about 6 or 7 of these radios in the bombers, all tuned to a particular frequency. And they used that to communicate. And after the war, when the military surplused all that, these could be acquired for about $5. But that was in 1945,
Yeah.
so it still wasn't particularly cheap, but it wasn't particularly expensive. And that era was kind of the golden era for people to get in there and start modifying the equipment to use it to communicate. So I see he has a very nice piece of commercial equipment here, but he also has a very nice piece of military surplus that he converted and probably used that first as he got involved in ham radio. So what period of time is your recollection?
50s and 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
Early 50s or late 50s?
Early 50s. That one photograph was probably 53 or 54. Mm-hmm. And as I said, he greatly expanded his equipment. I don't know, maybe he acquired it from the base or...
Good possibility,
Yeah.
because these were very common in all branches of the service.
I see.
So you'll see pictures of these in military histories and so forth, and nobody really recognizes what they are. That was a very common piece of equipment during or after the war, as well as the exchange of these informations into the commercial marketplace. So when I got my license in 1968, these were starting to disappear. And there was no internet. So it was hard to find them. And now you find them at very rarely at ham events. And they're going for well over $100 if you can find them. And the challenge is that people have modified them. So you don't know what's been done. But they're a very viable piece of equipment, and that's how many people got started. Off to our right here, we have some Heathkit equipment, which the people who were working on these started building their own radios. Heathkit was the way in which many people built this expensive equipment that they couldn't otherwise have. So very popular, and that was a very popular part of the exhibit because everybody remembered building a Heathkit, right? So this was there's a good example of that period of time here in the exhibit. And it's nice to see a picture like this because you can actually see it in action. And in this photograph, you can see the speaker, which is probably about 2 feet square. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad you could bring these out. And is this a photograph of your?
That's Grandpa. Mm-hmm. And it looks like maybe at that point the equipment had been moved downstairs. That's 1957. So, but in his job at Western Union and as a hobby too, I think he, of course, used Morse code, and he was extremely proficient. Tried to teach me. I didn't pick up on it to any great extent, but I can remember working with him. I got to work with him at Western Union on Saturday mornings. He was very busy, but he could just type out the Morse code as fast as you could. And I believe he taught other people as well.
Yeah, so in that period of time, you had to have a proficiency of, depending on the license that you had, anywhere from 5 words per minute to 25 words per minute. And the really, really good operators I've spoken to could do 40 to 50.
I would think he would have fallen in that category.
Sure.
He's extremely fast.
One of our other members was in the Navy, and he could do 60. He could copy 60 words per minute. So that was Dave Coons, who was someone else that is one of our legacy members of the club. Probably worked with Don
Probably so.
as the club grew. And because of the history of the club, we are actually the combination of 2 clubs, the Springfield Amateur Radio Association and the Western Ohio Repeater Association. So when those 2 clubs came together, you had this brain trust of people who came out of the military from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and people who had been in the war, and both Korean and World War II, who had this proficiency with vacuum tube based equipment and Morse code, which was much more common in the day. In the early 90s, they eliminated the requirement for Morse code because people weren't using it. This was at the inception of the internet.
Yeah.
And the need for that kind of communications capability went away, although there are a number of people who know Morse code, and we've taught Morse code to younger people who find it very interesting.
Yeah.
They want to know that.
Secret code.
That's right. It's a secret code. Their parents don't know it.
That's right.
And you can use it on your phone. So it still has a place. It requires less sophisticated equipment to operate with, and certain kinds of communications, it's the best way to do it. We do things like what they call meteor scatter, which is how it leverages the ion trail that's left by meteorites in the atmosphere. And you don't actually have to see them as shooting stars to know that exists. And people bounce signals off that. And the best method to do that is with Morse code.
Right.
Right. Because voice requires too much bandwidth.
Sure.
What other memories do you have about, what did you hear when you listened? Like, what intrigued you about it?
I think what intrigued me the most was sitting in the basement of our little house in Springfield, Ohio, talking, or actually, interchanging conversations with people in all parts of the world. I mean, Europe, Vietnam, which of course was on everybody's mind in the 60s, to South America. And it wasn't a long distance phone call, and we could talk as long as we wanted. And we were talking to GIs, and it just fascinated me, the ability to connect with people. The only thing we had to be mindful of was time zones, and to make sure people were where they could communicate with us at a certain time. But I just thought it was fascinating. And he would do it. He would stay in the basement on his equipment for hours. And I got to help a little bit. but he was obviously the driver. He taught me the different names of different pieces of equipment. I can remember sorting out his transistors and resistors, making a mess probably out of his workbench. And then he had an inventory of vacuum tubes, and I just thought he could do anything and fix anything and figure anything out.
Well, that's great. You had mentioned, and I think it's important to highlight that he was doing what we call phone patching. And
Patching, yes.
the reason you did that was because this was the pre-cell phone era. This was the landline era.
Yeah.
And it cost money.
It's expensive,
Right.
sure.
To make international calls if you had that availability. So ham radio fit a gap that existed at that time. And there was a whole organization called Military Auxiliary Radio Service that I'm sure he was part of, because that's how they coordinated these phone calls so that you could get the time set up for somebody to communicate and so forth. Do you remember if he was talking to people just locally, or when he was patching in, do you know if he was talking to local people or?
I have an impression that it was not
Okay.
so much, but more of just the service that he was providing for people to get word to him, and then he could patch through to wherever their family members were. I'm not sure of his involvement with the nuns in South America, but I know he was in communication with them on a pretty regular basis. So they must have had family in the States.
Sure.
So,
Well, I remember when I was in grade school, it was a nun at St. Mary's who encouraged me to get into amateur radio, and she was a licensed amateur.
oh,
So I think that might have been if you will, a hobby or an avocation to have that kind of communication skill. Did you ever see? This was back in the era when people would correspond about the fact that they talked on the radio. They would use what we called QSL cards.
yes.
And did you ever ever go through those, or
Oh, sure.
talk to?
Grandpa had a collection of QSL cards that we would just, my sisters and I didn't actually know. We had an idea of what they were because Grandpa had a box of them, and he would mail his out in exchange with other ham operators. This was framed on the wall, and it survived a couple generations of pictures and scrapbooks and things. So I'm so proud to have that. But we would take his box of QSL cards that he had collected and just sort and resort them and play with them.
It's interesting.
Yeah,
Now they're considered collector's items.
sure, of course.
And I just noticed on the back here, there's something about amplifier B.
I didn't notice that.
Something about the amplifier filament leads. So he always must have used these to take notes as well.
Sure, yeah. I'm sure he had boxes of them. But I'm glad somebody hung on to at least one of them so that we still have a family.
They're hard to find. So you say that your siblings were involved in this as well. Did they pick up the interest, or?
They really did. I was kind of the nerdy one, the three granddaughters. But everybody remembers Grandpa being involved. And we just, as kids, didn't realize the significance, I think. But of course, when you're older and you start to understand what that was all about, I can see how involved he was and how many other people's lives he touched.
Sure.
Not only through patching the calls, but local people who we would help, build towers, build their equipment. involvement in the clubs and so forth.
Right. It was a big community. It was a really,
Oh, yeah.
it still is a big community of people with a common interest that do these things. So we have tower crews, and we have training classes, and we do testing for the FCC and so forth. So it's changed in many ways, but the newer there's still people coming up that, and some people are very technical and some people aren't. They have other interests that get them interested. So we try and, there's something for everybody in this, and it's a lot of fun. So Kris, I want to thank you for taking some time with us.
Sure.
And just giving us a little background on who our founding members were in the Clark County Amateur Radio Association. And thank you for going back and looking for this information, because it has significant value to all of us in the hobby and in the community.
Well, thank you, Kevin. When I saw W8OG in the paper and heard about the exhibit, I almost couldn't believe my eyes. It had been a lot of years since I'd heard that call sign. So I'm happy to get back involved in it and learn more about it. And I appreciate the opportunity. So thank you.
Thank you again.